Thank you, Dan. You know, actually, we have a great opportunity today to present to you the issues that are really on the negotiating table in the period ahead. We have as many of you see, you have a booklet in front of you, Israel's Critical Security Needs for a Viable Peace. And the booklet is made up of about 6, 7 authors. 5 of them are top Israeli military people, and 3 of them are here today. So you've got the booklet and you have the panel. Let me introduce the subject, and I want to really thank the World Jewish Congress for taking up this issue. And Ronald, I want to thank you especially because the issues of Israeli security have always been close to your heart. I know that. And I also want to point out that the editor, the one who really produced this book, is your chief strategic person, Dan Diker. So it really, I think, shows the close network between what we're doing in the think tank world and what you're doing in the world of political action for the Jewish people. And I think that kind of symbiosis is very important. But let me begin just on a personal note of how I felt, why I felt this was so important to push this book and make this a subject for the Jerusalem Center. Years ago, when I served as foreign policy advisor to the Prime Minister, the year was 1997, and I was sitting in the Israeli cabinet, and there was a discussion about Israeli security requirements. How did this arise? Some of you might remember, this might be like diplomatic history from the 19th century, but it's only 10 years ago. The Oslo agreements contained in them, after the initial Israeli pullbacks, something called further redeployment, a very strange concept, but it required Israel to make 3 additional withdrawals in addition to what it initially had done. And at the time, we had negotiated with the United States and with Abu Mazen, Mahmoud Abbas, and we received assurances that Israel would decide by itself the size of those further redeployments. Well, we got a little bit of a pullback from the Clinton administration on that, and they were saying, no, well, we want to give our judgment. It must be a credible pullback. We didn't say we wouldn't voice our views. So the U.S. was suggesting to us a 13% pullback in the second further redeployment, 13% of the West Bank, of Judea and Samaria, and we had to know what kind of a pullback we could do. And there was a very important minister of trade at the time in the Israeli cabinet. His name was Natan Sharansky. And Natan made a very important point in the cabinet meeting. He said, how can I agree to any size pullback unless I know where we're going, unless I know what our security needs are? So as a result of that, Prime Minister at the time, Benjamin Netanyahu, turned to the Israeli army and says, I want you to develop a map to show us what we need to defend Israel in the West Bank, so that we know what the bottom line is before we start making payments. And the Israeli military developed a map. It was called the Interests Map. The army was very careful not to say these are future borders. And the Interests Map was presented before the Israeli cabinet. I remember Arik Sharon, who was not yet the Minister of Foreign Affairs, got up very close to every hill and say, no, you missed this point and that point. But other than that, the interest map was presented. But I think Prime Minister Netanyahu went a step further, knowing what Israel's security requirements are. He actually went to Washington, and he decided to present basically the same thing as the interest map. We slightly changed it, to President Clinton, Bill Clinton, in the map room. And I had the privilege back in 1997 of organizing the presentation for President Clinton and accompanying Prime Minister Netanyahu to the map room of the White House. It was the 2 of us and President Clinton and a member of the National Security Council from the United States. And we presented what Israel's security needs were in the West Bank and the Golan Heights. And for me personally, that experience accompanied my own work for many years later, when I worked with Ariel Sharon and also now with the Jerusalem Center. What was the lesson from that whole experience? And it's a lesson I got to give credit to Dan Diker for codifying in very succinct terms. Up until that point, Israeli governments were negotiating political understandings with the Palestinians, then taking the understanding, running to the Israeli army and saying, we made these agreements in Oslo or in Stockholm or any place else. Now you figure out how to defend the state of Israel. So that the politics and diplomacy came before security. What was revolutionary in this situation was rather than agree to the 13% that the Clinton administration was offering, or agreeing to any kind of outline at the Wye River, which came right after that, what Prime Minister Netanyahu insisted upon was establishing security first, and then going to have negotiations and understandings with the United States. It was a complete shift in the approach taken back in the late 1990s. That brings me to this book. I believe in the current situation we're facing, Israel has enormous opportunities with the Arab world. I mention the Arab world because the Palestinian situation is very complex. You have Hamas in Gaza, you have a weak Fatah in the West Bank. But we have opportunities with the Arab world because of perhaps an unintended side effect of the Iranian threat on this part of the Middle East. This is something which I think many have pointed out before, but basically because the Sunni Arab world is feeling, is sensing what are the implications of a nuclear Iran for regional subversion, they have shifted the primary focus of their attention from what used to be the threat of Israel to the threat of Iran. And when the doors are closed and when the movie lights are off, they are willing to admit that. And you see it in some of their main newspapers. There's the Saudi-owned newspaper in London, Sharq al-Awsat, when its main editors are making that point, and it's a Saudi-owned newspaper. That's the way Saudi Arabia communicates to the world without having its foreign minister make that statement. So we have a rare opportunity in which the planets are lined up for reaching better understandings with the Arab world. What's the caveat and what's the important point to remember? That brings me to the book and to this panel. We can proceed with new political understandings with this region as long as we constantly have in mind, first, what are the security requirements of Israel? As I learned from General Amidor in our previous book on defensible borders, we don't know what the region's going to look like in 5 years, 10 years. The United States is pulling out of Iraq, and I'm sure that will be spoken about by others. And therefore, we have to be very certain that the security we have in place is solid. And that's why it is good to know that the Israeli negotiating team that has gone to Washington will begin its discussions with the Palestinian Authority about security first. But what's our role? We're not in Washington. We're here. I think our role is to strengthen the hand of the Israeli government as it pursues a security-first approach. Because many people in the U.S., in Europe, and elsewhere will try and erode our security demands. One last comment, because I was doing research for the Hebrew edition of this book. You know, former Prime Minister Ehud Barak, now Defense Minister, back in the year 2000, really didn't want to give up large parts of the Jordan Valley because he understood how important the Jordan Valley was for our security. And when this was presented in May 2000 to the Palestinians, they walked out of the room. So some in the Israeli military said, you know what, we have an idea for you. How to have your cake and eat it too in the Jordan Valley. We will put in a multinational force in the Jordan Valley, and we'll have an Israeli component. So that way the Palestinians can feel, oh, this is international forces. but there'll be an Israeli component to guarantee Israeli interests. This was the idea that they came up with. Well, do you know what happened within months of that being put on the table? The U.S. negotiators said, thank you for conceding the Jordan Valley. We're going to take your multinational force with an Israeli component, and we're going to throw away the Israeli component. I am, of course, putting this in very terse, strong terms. In other words, it's very easy in the course of negotiations where you come up with a new idea, where you try and be creative, to have your fundamental interest in that idea rejected. And what do you end up with? International forces protecting the state of Israel. And that'll be one of the main subjects that General Amidor will raise. So what I'm pointing out is that, and I'll say this in summary, what we have today is a unique opportunity because of the changes in the wider Arab world. The Palestinian system is weak, and we know that. But we should seize that opportunity as long as we keep in mind the risks we face in this region and the need to reinforce our security given that uncertainty. And I think that's the importance of the book that you've all been given. And I think that's the importance of the panel you're about to hear from this morning. I think to begin today's work, I would like to turn to Major General Reserves Uzi Dayan. Uzi has an illustrious history in Israeli security, having been the commander of Sayeret Matkal, the commander of Central Command, having also been the Deputy Chief of Staff of the IDF and the National Security Advisor to two prime ministers, Ehud Barak and Ariel Sharon. And so with that breadth of experience, I think Uzi can help us understand the fundamental needs Israel has for defensible borders and for security arrangements that can be lasting on the ground. So I'll first turn the floor over to Uzi. We're going to ask each speaker to speak for 10 minutes, and that'll leave us enough time for questions on these topics. Uzi.